On a late autumn afternoon in New York, a cold wind blew through the crowded streets. Thomas Mitchell, a 65-year-old retired carpenter, walked slowly into an upscale coffee shop on Fifth Avenue. He wore an old coat, his face marked by the traces of time, but his eyes still exuded kindness and silence. Inside the shop, the warm atmosphere contrasted sharply with the cold outside. Elegant customers chatted animatedly over expensive cups of coffee, while waiters busily brought trays of drinks. Thomas walked up to the counter, slowly took out his wallet, and politely ordered a cup of hot tea. However, as soon as he spoke, the eyes of the store manager, an arrogant man named Jason, suddenly darkened. He looked Thomas up and down with contempt, as if his presence in this upscale coffee shop was unacceptable. Jason crossed his arms over his chest, a half smile on his face. He approached the counter, glanced at Thomas again, and said coldly, "Sorry, but I think you would be more comfortable in a cheap place. This place doesn't serve your type of customer." The remark was loud enough for several nearby customers to hear. A few turned to look, but no one spoke. Thomas kept his face calm, showing no anger or confusion. He simply placed the bill on the counter. "I just want a cup of hot tea. I can pay like anyone else here." Jason let out a small laugh of derision. He shook his head, pushing the bill back in front of him. "It's not about the money. We have certain standards. I'm sure you understand what I mean." His words were full of hidden meaning. Thomas clenched his fists slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I have worked hard for the past 40 years contributing to this city, to this country. And now, just because my appearance doesn't fit your coffee shop, I'm not allowed to sit here?" Jason shrugged, pretending to look regretful. "It's not that I want to make things difficult for you, but our customers prefer a luxurious space. Maybe the park on the corner would be a better choice for you." Some people around started whispering. Some avoided Thomas's eyes. Some just silently continued drinking their coffee. Thomas looked straight at Jason, his eyes not angry, but only deep disappointment. "You judge people just by the way they dress?" Jason curled his lips. "It's not me, it's the way this world works." He turned to the security guard nearby and signaled, "Take him out politely." The security guard, a young man, was a little hesitant, but under Jason's stern gaze, he reluctantly walked towards Thomas. Everything seemed to have been decided. But at that moment, a small noise came from the corner of the cafe. A man put down his coffee cup on the table and slowly stood up. He was tall, wearing a long black coat. He took off his sunglasses and hat, revealing a familiar face. Daniel Carter, one of the most famous movie stars in the world. The atmosphere in the cafe suddenly became strangely silent. All eyes were on Daniel, including Jason, who had been very confident just a moment ago, but now looked a little confused. Daniel walked slowly towards Thomas, standing right next to him. He looked straight at Jason, his voice low but powerful. "I also want to know why he is not welcome here." Daniel Carter's appearance made the atmosphere in the cafe heavy. All the chatter suddenly disappeared, leaving only a stifling silence. Some customers recognized him, whispering excitedly to each other, but Daniel paid no attention to that. He stood up straight, his cold eyes turned toward Jason. Jason swallowed but still tried to keep his composure. He slightly raised the corner of his lips, although his confidence had clearly dropped significantly. "Mr. Carter, I didn't expect to see you here." Daniel didn't respond to that polite greeting. He just tilted his head, his voice slow but full of weight. "I'll ask again. Why isn't he being served here?" Jason glanced quickly at Thomas, then looked around as if to seek support from the other customers. But this time, Everyone avoided his eyes. The feeling of being cornered made him start to feel confused. "Well, I just think our place has a certain style, and sometimes consistency in space is important." "What style?" Daniel interrupted, his voice dropping a little. "A style that only serves well-dressed people, or a style that discriminates against people you think don't fit in?" Jason was speechless. He tried to force a smile, but it was clear that the situation was no longer within his control. Some of the staff standing nearby also began to whisper. They had never seen their manager cornered like this. Thomas remained still, his eyes not angry but calm. He spoke softly. "You don't have to defend me, Daniel. I have been through this kind of thing many times in my life." Daniel turned to look at him, his eyes a little sad, but then he smiled lightly. "You may be used to it, but that doesn't mean it's right." He turned back to Jason, his voice no longer a question but a declaration. "He will drink tea here, and I will pay." Jason paled slightly. He glanced around at the surrounding customers, hoping to find some kind of unspoken agreement, but everyone was silent. Some even nodded in agreement. At this moment, a waitress, a young woman, suddenly stepped forward. She looked at Jason, then turned to Daniel and Thomas, her voice firm. "I will make him tea." Jason looked at the waitress in surprise, but said nothing. He knew he had lost this confrontation. Meanwhile, Daniel gently pulled out a chair for Thomas to sit down, then sat down next to him, as a sure affirmation that he was not alone. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to change. The awkward silence gradually gave way to respectful glances, supportive smiles. Jason had no choice but to stand still, confused by the turn of events. Jason stood still, his hands clenched. He couldn't believe that in just a few short minutes, the situation had completely reversed. A few minutes ago, he was in control, giving orders, chasing away customers, showing off his power. But now, he was being watched with scrutiny by the customers in the shop, and Daniel Carter, a movie superstar, was openly siding with the old carpenter. The young waitress quickly brought a cup of hot tea, gently placing it in front of Thomas with a sincere smile. "Enjoy your tea." Thomas nodded his thanks, then reached out to take the cup of tea. His fingers, calloused from years of hard work, trembled slightly from the cold, but he still carefully took a small sip. The warmth of the tea spread, not only in his heart, but also in the surrounding space. Jason cleared his throat, trying to regain control. He crossed his arms over his chest, his voice becoming a little harsher. "I don't think this is necessary. This is just a small misunderstanding." Daniel slowly turned to him, his sharp eyes cutting through every excuse. "Misunderstanding? No. I think you know very well what you've done." Jason opened his mouth to retort, but Daniel continued. "The sad thing is not how you treated him, but how you think it's normal." No one in the restaurant spoke. Some of the diners, who had been hesitant at first, now expressed their agreement with slight nods. A middle-aged man in a suit stood up and said, "Actually, I feel uncomfortable witnessing this too. No one deserves to be treated like this, just because they look different." An elderly woman nearby also spoke softly. "I come to this shop often, but today is the first time I feel something is not right." Those words were like knives cutting into Jason's self-esteem. He took a step back, his eyes wavering. Meanwhile, Thomas put down his teacup and looked straight at Jason. He was not angry, not blaming, only a deep calmness. "You may think I'm just a poor old man who doesn't deserve to sit here. But I used to have days when I was young and strong like you. I worked hard all my life, building houses, repairing buildings that you may have walked through. And yet, just because I'm not wearing an expensive suit, you think I don't deserve respect? Jason opened his mouth, but couldn't say anything. Daniel looked at him for a long time, then shook his head. You don't have to answer right now, but you should think about it. Jason lowered his head, a feeling of embarrassment and shame appearing in his heart for the first time. The atmosphere in the cafe was still a little tense, but the situation had clearly changed. Jason, who had always appeared confident and in control, now stood silently, unable to find any excuses. Daniel Carter's words still echoed in his head, and Thomas Mitchell's calm but determined gaze made him feel smaller than ever. Daniel turned to Thomas, smiling warmly. Would you like something to eat? I'll treat you. Thomas shook his head slightly, placing his hand on his teacup. Just a cup of tea would be enough, my boy. Thank you for standing up for me. Daniel smiled, then turned to look at Jason again. But this time, there was no reproach in his eyes, but something deeper, a message, a chance for him to change. Jason, Daniel said, his voice calm, I'm not here to humiliate you or make you feel like a bad person. I just want you to understand that sometimes, what we think is normal can hurt others. Jason pursed his lips, not responding immediately. He could feel the eyes around him waiting for his reaction. He took a deep breath, then slowly spoke. Maybe I was wrong. A slight surprise spread through the cafe. Some customers turned to each other. It seemed like they didn't expect an admission of mistake from someone like Jason. But Daniel just nodded, as if he had expected this. No one is perfect, Daniel said, but the important thing is that we can learn and change. Jason was silent for a long time, then suddenly turned to the young employee from earlier. His voice was no longer arrogant, but a little hesitant but sincere. Bring him some cookies, I'll pay. The employee was surprised for a moment, then quickly nodded. Some of the diners smiled at Jason's change. Thomas looked at him for a moment, then chuckled. Thank you, young man. Jason just nodded, saying nothing more. But in his heart, something had changed. Daniel looked at the scene before him with satisfaction. He knew that he could not change the whole world in just one day, but at least he had planted a seed, a reminder that respect and kindness were never a luxury. The cafe gradually returned to normal, but the atmosphere had changed. The previously silent customers began to chat with each other about what had just happened. Some looked at Jason with different eyes, no longer contempt or annoyance, but curiosity mixed with thought. The waitress quickly brought a plate of cookies to Thomas, gently placing it on the table in front of him. Enjoy your meal, she said with a genuine smile. Thomas nodded his thanks, slowly breaking off a piece of cookie and sipping it with his tea. He said nothing, but his eyes shone with satisfaction. Jason stood nearby, still confused. This was probably the first time in his life he had been challenged in this way. Before, he had always believed that power was in his hands, that the customers who came to this cafe had to abide by the standards he set. But now, seeing an old man who simply wanted to enjoy a cup of tea in peace, he realized he was wrong. He let out a small sigh, then walked closer to Thomas's table. A moment of hesitation flashed across his face before he spoke. I am sorry. Thomas looked up, his gentle eyes looking at Jason as if he had anticipated this. He put down his teacup, smiling slightly. We all make mistakes, young man. The important thing is whether we realize it and correct it or not. Jason nodded slowly, as if he was remembering every word. Daniel Carter, who had witnessed it all, smiled with satisfaction. He gently placed his hand on Jason's shoulder, as if to encourage him. Today, you have learned something important. Don't let it just be a fleeting moment. Jason said nothing, but in his heart he knew that this was a lesson he would never forget. After that moment of silence, the cafe seemed to warm up. A few customers started smiling at Thomas. Some nodded at Daniel as if to show their support. The young waitress returned to the bar, but her eyes were still sparkling with joy as she witnessed the change in the atmosphere. Jason was still standing there, seemingly deep in thought. He had always believed that status and appearance determined a person's worth. But today, an old man who simply wanted to drink tea made him question everything he had ever thought was true. Daniel patted him on the shoulder and turned to Thomas. "How long have you been a carpenter?" Thomas took a sip of tea, smiling. "More than 40 years, my friend. I've worked on many large projects, repairing many old houses. These hands may not be as clean as those of the businessmen in the city, but I'm proud that they have helped me support my family and contribute to the community." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with respect. "That is something to be proud of, and today I am proud to sit with you." Those words were not only for Thomas, but also for everyone present in the shop. Some customers who had just quietly observed before now took the initiative to smile at Thomas. A middle-aged man stood up and walked towards him. "I have a small workshop that needs some repairs. If you are still in business, I would be happy to invite you to cooperate." Thomas laughed, surprise shining in his eyes. "Of course, I'm still very healthy." Jason witnessed this scene and couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He tried to push Thomas out of the cafe, but instead, he not only stayed, but was welcomed with new opportunities. Daniel looked at him, then said softly, "Sometimes a small action can change a whole day, even a whole life." Jason nodded slightly. This time there was no defensiveness or arrogance in his eyes. The cafe returned to its normal routine, but something had changed. Not just for Jason, but for everyone present that day. As the morning progressed, the cafe was bustling as usual, but the atmosphere was completely different. The indifferent gazes from before had now become warmer, more open. The story of Thomas Mitchell, a carpenter who just wanted a cup of tea but was refused, would not be quickly forgotten. Jason stood still for a while, looking around the cafe with a strange feeling. He was no longer the cold manager he had been when he first started his shift. What happened today had made him realize one thing. Power did not lie in controlling who could enter this cafe, but in how he treated the people who walked through the door. Daniel Carter stood up, turned to Thomas with a sincere smile. "Today I am honored to sit with you." Thomas nodded, his eyes warm. "You are not only a good actor, but also a good person. Thank you, Daniel." Daniel just smiled slightly, then turned his eyes to Jason. He knew what was coming. Taking a deep breath, Jason slowly said, "I am truly sorry for my behavior just now. I was wrong." This time, there was no hesitation or force in his words. It was a sincere apology. Thomas nodded slightly. "The important thing is not that you were wrong, but that you realized it." Jason looked around the restaurant, then continued, "I will change some of the rules here. I don't want something like today to happen again." A few customers smiled slightly. Some nodded in agreement. It wasn't an immediate change, but at least it was a start. Daniel was satisfied with this result. He patted Jason's shoulder before walking out of the restaurant. But before he left, he paused and said, "Respect is not something to be asked for. It is something everyone deserves. Today I learned that. Don't let it be just a fleeting moment. Then he left, leaving behind a cafe that was no longer the same, and a person who had begun to change. Inside, Thomas continued to sip his tea with a satisfied smile. The story of Thomas Mitchell, Jason, and Daniel Carter is more than just a coffee shop situation. It reflects a common problem in society: the hasty judgment of others based on their appearance, occupation, or circumstances. But more deeply, it also teaches us that everyone deserves respect, and that sometimes a small act can make a big difference in another person's life.